Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session. It was a very long day. And today we have with us Varun. We are delighted to have Varun with us today. Varun is the Dean and Professor of Information Management and Analytics at SP Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai, India. Varun holds a PhD in Management, an MBA from Boston University, an MS in Computer Engineering from North Carolina State University, and a BTech in Electrical Engineering from IIT Bombay. Varun has held senior leadership roles, including C-level responsibilities for venture-funded startups as well as public companies in the US, and has previously taught at the University of Notre Dame, Pepperdine University, and Boston University. So today, Varun will talk about innovation for sustainability with a focus on wise innovation. So Varun, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. It's not easy being the last speaker before dinner, and I know I probably interrupted people's drinks. I'll try and present sort of hopefully a different point of view, which whether you're an academic or an industry professional, hopefully you find interesting and a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about a concept called wise innovation. This is sort of the research focus of our university in Mumbai. SPJMR is known in India as sort of one of the early pioneers of around sustainability and societal impact about 30, 35 years ago, when those terms were not even in use prior to 1987 and the Brundtland Report as well. So I want to show you how within India, we look at sustainability from a slightly different lens that I hope expands our conversation today. So I'll lay out the definition of wise innovation as we see it, and then maybe propose some research questions and possibly a research and a practice agenda that could follow. So I'll just lay out the situation, complication, and question that we're looking for. Why wise innovation is the question, and I'm just laying the context for that. We all agree innovation might hold the key to a better world, but we all also know that innovation should be handled with care, especially in the world of AI being maybe a very stark example of the fact that sometimes what you don't know might hurt you more than it might help you. So innovation is great, but the consequences of innovation can often be fraught with peril. And so then the question really is, if that's the case, what is it that can make corporations do the right thing? And while you can certainly count, and especially in Europe, I know you count on your governments and the EU and so forth a lot. In the United States, which is where I spent most of my time, you don't tend to pay that much attention to the government and their regulations. And therefore, you might sort of say, is it consumers that are going to drive good behavior? Is it consumers that are going to drive the right kind of innovation and the right kind of thought processes? Or is it something else? Should corporations have themselves a better way of innovating? And that's really the question that we're asking. Is there a better way for organizations and for individual innovators to innovate in a more responsible, wise manner? And so before I get down to how we might do so, I just wanted to define two terms. Obviously, the whole conference is around innovation, but it's sometimes worthwhile to go back to basics and understand the definition of that phrase. So I tend to we all follow journals. Amongst the journals that is an important one for me is the Journal of Product Innovation Management. It's, FT50 A-star type journal there. And most recently, they had a good redefinition of implementation. They looked at 40 years of innovation research and concluded that the phrase had lost its meaning. They concluded basically that everybody uses innovation in whatever form they want. And so this particular research project was about going back to the basics and coming up with a foundational redefinition of innovation so that future innovation research could build on, hopefully, standard vocabulary again. And this particular paper basically laid out this definition of innovation, saying it's an implementation. So unless something comes to life, it's not an innovation. So it's an implementation of a novel idea, so that it needs to be something new, and it needs to produce an outcome that creates value, right? So these are sort of the core tenets of the definition of innovation. And then the author went into describing sustainability-oriented innovation, green innovation, social innovation, etc., using this particular nomenclature or syntax. Now, separately, the Oslo Manual defined innovation in a very similar manner. Innovation is defined either as an outcome or is defined as an implementation. So you can look at it as what results and what you do in order to produce that result, right? So generally, innovation is defined in this manner, right? It is a set of activities that results in an outcome that has some sort of a value to society at large. So with that in mind, the question is, let's look at what wisdom is. And here's sort of hopefully the new thing that I bring to the table today. If you look at wisdom, there is an increasing amount of interest in wisdom and the wisdom literature in management. Not just in the innovation discipline, but across various disciplines. And the European view of ERS, to some degree, one would argue, flows from a much older tradition of what wisdom is. And again, I'm not claiming any credit from the East or any kind of Eastern spirituality here. If you basically look at Western philosophy and the Greeks as a start of the philosophical tradition and the wisdom tradition in the West, it's very simple. All of Greek wisdom can basically be summarized as wisdom is basically knowledge. And it's knowledge about how to succeed at living, quote unquote, the good life. Right? And the good life is defined as one that can be a combination of hedonistic life, meaning pleasure for yourself, but with concerns for those around you. So there's a rich definition in the Greek tradition, and then subsequently in the Christian spiritual tradition, around what wisdom is. Coming from the East, and I'm just picking the Hindu tradition here of the Bhagavad Gita, as opposed to I could have picked the Tao tradition, I could have picked Zen and so forth. Wisdom is basically viewed as knowledge for everyday living. So as you can see, the definitions of wisdom are not that different between the East and the West, and we're talking about sort of texts that go back maybe 3,000 years that researchers have continued to work on. And this is not an Eastern thing. The most active centers for wisdom are the Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago, Macquarie University in Australia, the University of Florida. These are the fountainheads, if you will, of the modern wisdom tradition. And these basically are the practices that wisdom scholars have said are good practices for somebody who wants to live the good life. Right? And I'm going to bridge it back to innovation and talk about what wise innovation is in a second. But broadly speaking, wisdom practices, meaning what would a wise person do? What would a wise organization do? What would a wise innovator do? Basically fall into three things. There's a way wise people think, there's a way wise people feel, and there's a way wise people act. In terms of how they think, sort of the cognitive dimension, if you will, they begin with the fact that they really are ignorant, right? I think Aristotle made the case, or maybe it was Socrates that made the case, that wisdom comes from recognizing your ignorance. So the idea that you never actually have the answers is the starting point of the cognitive dimension of wisdom. But then as you try to build the answer, the other bullets over there come into play. The fact that things are interconnected, think about The Matrix, for example, it's a brilliant movie, entirely based around wisdom traditions. The fact that things are interconnected, and then you need to be curious about these interconnections. You need to essentially understand that multiple perspectives are required for you to make a decision of some sort, and you need to spend the time to reflect, meditate, be thoughtful, be mindful about all the things that you're seeing out there. That basically represents the cognitive dimension of wisdom as to how knowledge is created even when you don't have the knowledge to begin with. The second part is a knowledgeable person, a wise person, feels certain things. Calmness or emotional regulation, that was a phrase used by the Greeks, is fundamental to wisdom, as is caring about what those outcomes are. And finally, on the behavioral dimension, a wise person knows that they have to act. In The Matrix, big fan of the movie there, this guy says, because I must, not because I can, right? Because I must. The notion that you're obligated to act and you need to be decisive even in the face of uncertainty is key to wisdom. Now, how does one bring wisdom into management theory? So this is a very popular topic in many, many business schools in the US and certainly in India about how do you bring these particular elements into management theory, into marketing, into operations, supply chain, innovation, and so forth. And this is basically how we bring innovation and wisdom together. So we define wise innovation as innovation that is done the right way and that is done for the right reasons. Right? And we're coming back to sort of the idea of generativity and regeneration and sustainability and so forth. Things done the right way for the right reasons is what wise innovation is. And tying it back to the definition, the modern definition of innovation, if you recall, innovation had two parts to it. There was an outcome part, and there was an implementation part. An outcome is really doing it for the right outcomes, for the right reasons. An implementation, you would agree, is about doing it the right way. So therefore, what we're really looking at is how can we apply all of those wisdom principles we talked about earlier, things that a wise person does, in order to drive the right outcome and to do the right innovation. So I'll just present our model that we use in order to do so. If you look at innovation for the right outcomes, or the right reasons, we all agree that innovation has an x-axis, which is around novelty, right? The degree of novelty might vary from extremely radical innovation to incremental innovation, or things that are new to you, if not new to the world. So we're all familiar as innovation scholars as to what that x-axis is. The y-axis is really the benefit or the value that you get. And here, we agree that there are at least three kinds of value, right? Coming from the Triple P, from Elkington, or from the Brundtland report, we all know that there are at least three dimensions of value around economic, societal, and environmental. And we know that there is a notion of time. Some things might be okay in the short term, but not okay in the long term. Some things might take a long term to actually realize. So what you're really looking at in terms of the outcome is how does your novelty translate into value? And the value here is really around three dimensions over time. And what wise innovation is trying to do is seek outcomes that are net positive. And I think this is language we've been using. I'm just positioning it in a different way. When you take these three things, people, profit, planet, or economic, social, environmental, whatever rocks your boat, and they all have different units of measurement, what does net positive even mean? How do you know you're net positive? And one thing has a dimension of money, another thing has a dimension of human health or education, another thing has an aspect of planetary depletion. So it's not an easy mathematical spreadsheet to put together, but conceptually we are seeking this net positive impact over a period of time. And the key here is no one innovation can actually achieve all of this. So I'll give you an example of a wonderful company in the United States called Gotham Green. Gotham Greens is a food company that basically went and retrieved a whole bunch of spaces in urban America that were falling into blight and decided to start doing urban gardening and urban farming there. So the food that's produced by Gotham Greens is food that otherwise was in, food being grown in slum areas that have been destroyed, bad parts of New York City, Detroit, and so on and so forth, right? So they've created employment. They've recovered blighted urban neighborhoods in order to create organic food. And they now are selling this organic food in supermarkets. Now the question is, what kind of packaging should they use? So the company went ahead and said, since we're going to be green all the way, let's look for the most green kind of packaging there is, right? They were trying to optimize across all three Ps at one time. But this is not an easy thing to do. In fact, it's a foolish errand. What they basically found was that the best packaging they could come up with, that was most biodegradable, that was totally recyclable and so forth, also had the least amount of shelf life. And therefore, resulted in a higher amount of waste of this wonderfully grown organic food. So now you're in a conundrum, right? This is what life is. You can't solve everything at one shot. And so the decision they made was that it was more important to them in the short term to basically get the food out there that would last a longer period of time. So grudgingly, they've actually used a kind of packaging that is not the most high-tech packaging. It's not what you would consider the most environmentally friendly packaging. But the most important research project they have going right now is environmentally friendly packaging that will give them better results than what they currently have. So it's a very messy pursuit of the 3P. It's not a one-shot. It's not one innovation that is going to solve all of this problem. It's a collection or a portfolio of projects that you do that hopefully move your portfolio towards this kind of a sustainable net positive impact. And that's really what I was referring to here. It may just require a continuous evolution of the solution here. I'll give you one from a food service example. So in India, it's very, very popular now to deliver everything in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and so forth. It's really insane. And it's insane because it has millions of young people now flying around on their motorcycles and mopeds to try and deliver products within 10 minutes and 5 minutes and 15 minutes. It's a race to the bottom, honestly. because we're essentially emphasizing consumer convenience. So it's kind of like the fast fashion examples being used today. Think of it as convenience being viewed as a god, and all business basically aligning to deliver the fastest possible delivery to customers who might want anything under the sun. I don't know how we got there, but that's how we got there. Two companies are the leaders in that space. They're both under attack for essentially causing environmental pollution, traffic deaths, accidents, smog, pollution, and really all kinds of negative activities. But they're delivering customer benefit, right? They're delivering the person who wants his pizza delivered in 8 minutes will get it in 8 minutes. So now what is it that you do? So these companies have now started looking at a range of features that might achieve a better balance. So for example, you have a choice of choosing between a 25-minute delivery that might allow a delivery driver to combine 2 or 3 delivery options, right? So that they're reducing their fuel usage, but it takes 25 minutes. Versus something that you might get in 5 minutes or 8 minutes, but clearly produces more CO2. And they play out how much CO2 each of these options are producing. And the default option is actually set to the bigger number, right? So slower delivery is what the default option is set, because psychology tells you that most people don't change the default option. So here's a way in which this company that has contributed to evil, if you will, or contributed to pollution, is taking a second step or a third step in order to try and get that balance right between customer convenience, which is what businesses should strive to deliver, otherwise they will not be sustainable, and being sustainable from a planetary point of view. So I don't think this is a straightforward path, right? This requires a fairly longer, wiser view of the future as it rolls out, as opposed to the knee-jerk view saying, you cannot do this because it produces something bad. You have to take a longer term perspective on this. And if you then look at the second part, so this is sort of what we teach, this is what our research agenda is, and this is what we're working with companies on. If you're trying to create the kind of outcomes I'm describing, what kind of processes should you have within your company? As Dean basically mentioned, I spent a long time in industry. I spent 30 years in Silicon Valley as a chief executive officer of 2 startups and a public company. So I always look at research problems in terms of what can you do to get things done. Within a company, there are core processes that produce that innovation, right? Innovation isn't something where a CEO just says, make something happen and it happens. There tends to be a core development approach, which is really either built around the lean startup method, or it's built around design thinking, or it might be built on 1 or 2 other core approaches, towards what you would consider the core process of innovation. But that by itself isn't enough. That is not going to produce the kind of balanced 3P over time kind of outcome that we're looking for. And so you need to surround it with systems thinking, because systems thinking provides context and causality to the solution that you're building. That's the only way you're going to know if what you're doing is in fact producing the outcome at the system level. Otherwise, design thinking just tells you what you're doing for the human being, which is a wonderful thing, but it's only a part of the overall system. So systems thinking, which unfortunately isn't taught in enough business schools, I think has become key. So as the dean of my business school, I have basically insisted that systems thinking go hand in hand with design thinking. So our innovation portfolio of courses includes systems thinking and design thinking and the lean startup method, because I don't believe they can work in isolation of each other. Responsible innovation, to give EU credit where it's due, is very much a European Union context, with Professors Owen and Stilwell from the UK, having driven the idea of responsible innovation, where an innovator asks, what are the consequences of this innovation? Can I anticipate what this thing might do? And they've proposed a way in which you can involve community. But again, in the real world, you can't involve the community and the government in everything. Companies have to do things themselves with their stakeholders, and therefore we look at responsible innovation a little bit differently in terms of looking at consequence and the conscience of doing something or the other. And we finally use critical thinking, which is first principles thinking, to assess if all of this stuff makes sense. Now, why do I present this as one possible model? And I'm just saying it's one possible model for wise innovation. There could be others. I look at it as one possible model because then I look at the relevant wisdom practices and say, if I were to look at the process we have put together versus the requirements of wisdom, do they match or not? And my contention is, at this point, I would be able to make the case that most of these practices that define wisdom are reflected in this particular process. So if you were to take a look at diverse perspective taking, reflexivity, and awareness of interconnectedness. That's what systems thinking and responsible thinking would give you. How would you implement it in a company? I think that's what Dean was going to ask me. You would implement it in a company through your quarterly business reviews. You would implement it through your agile planning, if you had any software involved. You have stand-up meetings. There are so many opportunities as an executive and as an innovator to drive these kinds of principles into those particular processes. And so that's what we're trying to drive, at least education-wise and pedagogy-wise. And that's what our center that we'll talk about is trying to engage with our industries in India to see if we can have them actually put all of this stuff together. And I'll give you an example or two of companies that may have at least started scratching the surface of this. And so I think I'd like to just conclude by saying, I do think there is a gap in knowledge of how you implement innovation that does this kind of net positive over time set of benefits. And it's a little bit different, in my mind, than what sustainable innovation is or what even regenerative innovation is. Because I think what you're looking at is taking a longer-term view of three variables that seem to coexist very uneasily. It is a paradox. And this wise innovation is about resolving this particular paradox of how you balance three things that fundamentally don't seem to fit well together. Wisdom is something some management scholars are turning to, saying, are there some interesting insights in wisdom, in ancient philosophy, Greek or otherwise, that might be able to guide us? And from that, as we look to incorporate wise practices, we're basically working with this particular model. But what I'd like to invite you to think about is, if you were to look at the problem this way, I think there are many questions one could look at. How does one actually measure net impact? How do you balance profit versus the environment versus people? I don't think there are clear, good answers for that. Again, what kinds of structures and tools and things working together might allow you to resolve this paradox of the three Ps actually being in tension with each other? What is the role of AI in innovation? We had a session on AI, but we barely scratched the surface about how AI could be used to collect data, right? And how AI could be basically used to make certain kinds of decisions. But this is a much harder problem. How can you use AI in order to do the right thing? How would you actually finance something like this? How does project financing work when the benefits are things you cannot normalize down to dollars and cents? What are the socio-political implications or the cultural implications of this? I'm pretty sure how we interpret it in India is quite different from how you interpret it in the EU. But what does that mean? The one that I'm researching personally is the role of individual mindsets. Though you may provide a process, an individual has agency. An individual can choose to totally ignore a process. An individual can choose to compromise a process if they want to. You have to understand an individual's motivations as well within an organizational context. So I'm actually looking at two mindsets. I've just completed a study that looks at the paradox mindset and that looks at the compassion mindset and the interaction between them to see how people's intentions express themselves on responsible innovation. So there's a whole amount there to be done. And tomorrow I'm really looking forward to some case studies, and I'll probably be looking at the case studies from the lens of wise innovation and sort of saying, are there elements here that I could basically recast for my students, for my fellow researchers, and for industry back in India in terms of examples of wise innovation, whether you've called it that or not, right? So that's basically what we'd be looking at. So that's all I had, and I'm sorry I took this much time this late in the day, right? So.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation and for sharing your external thoughts on wise innovation with us. I have some few questions. Some of them you have already answered, but let me rephrase some of them. And regarding the concept of wise innovation and its practical implications. So, and the first one, you mentioned the WISE Tech. So you have launched at SPJ Institute of Management Research the WISE Innovation Studio for Emerging Technologies. Can you elaborate on the vision and objectives of this center? And in particular, how it can contribute to the development of solutions that drive positive impact on the society and the planet?
Okay, thank you. We just, for those of you who are part of the university, when EFMD or EQUIS shows up to do the accreditation, reaccreditation, they have a standard set of annoying questions that they ask you. So one of the ones that we had were, are your centers research centers because they don't seem like research centers, right? And they're not. We have 4 centers, and we call them centers of practice. Because to us, dissemination and influence, the center is well suited for that, right? It's about bridging academia with practice and bridging students with practice. So the WiseTech Center that we have actually has 3 objectives. The first objective is we are an incubator of startups. The second thing we do in WiseTech is we accelerate startups. And the third part we have is open innovation, which is a little closer to what Insure Hub is. So on the incubation part, we basically fund any of our students or even students from a broader set of universities that want to get going on their startup. We fund them for 2 years post their MBA. We surround them with 35 venture capitalists, about 65 CXOs that we have as a mentor pool, in order to help them get their company off the ground in the incubation phase. And at the end of 2 years, if they decide to call it quits, we basically have them rejoin the placement process, and we place them just like any other MBA, except now they have 2 years of experience of trying to do something on their own. So that's sort of an incubation thing, and that also means we try and bring lots of startups in to really build an entrepreneurial culture amongst our students, right? Entrepreneurship is pretty key to me, given my background. It's pretty key to the country in India right now, and so that's what that portion is. In acceleration, we take companies that already have incubated elsewhere or are up and running, and we try and take them from, so if you think of incubation as 0 to 1, if you use the Peter Thiel language, acceleration would probably be from 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, right? So we try and work with them, again, with our resources and our funding network and so forth in that particular phase. Now, in these situations, we are picking companies that have at least a double bottom line impact. So we will not work with companies that are a pure gaming company, for example. We will not work with fintech companies that have no play at the bottom of the pyramid. But we would work with a fintech company that is looking to increase financial access and inclusivity if we felt that, over time, that was something that they could do. So that's how these WISE principles come into our selection of which companies join our incubator and accelerator. Any finance theorist would say that's probably a bad thing to do, right? Because you're automatically reducing the number of companies. But we're an educational institution. We're not necessarily looking to get a return on investment on our time. And so we believe these are the companies to go. So that's how the WISE part of what we said in terms of outcomes come into our selection process of the companies we choose to incubate or accelerate. The open innovation part is where I'm actually struggling. And the reason I'm here and so excited about tomorrow is you guys are years ahead of us, right? What I want to do in our open innovation part is engage with industry to take these particular concepts into those companies. The fact is, this is a very normative, mission-driven, almost a zealous kind of a pitch, right? It is not a super scholarly empirical thing. And the reason I'm trying to do some empirical work is to give it some scientific backing. But as of now, a lot of this, one would argue, is, inductive, if you will. If it worked here, it must work here, kind of a thing. So we're trying to put companies together where we have a chance to work with them on these. We have a conference in February where we're going to be doing what we call a Chatham House Rules type of conference. We're bringing in about 50 CXOs. We're laying out 2 topics that are WISE innovation related, breaking into groups and seeing what they come up with. So we're not at a point where we have, eminent companies describing projects they've already done, which is the reason I'm so excited about tomorrow. But that's really what we're trying to do with open innovation, and I think you guys are setting the standard for that.
Thank you. We have to book in our agendas a conference in India in February next year. So let's do so. Another question. So you emphasized inclusivity and a broad stakeholder perspective as a central to WISE innovation. So what strategies would you recommend to innovators who may struggle with aligning or prioritizing diverse and at times conflicting stakeholders' interests?
That's an excellent question. So one of the pictures I had around responsible innovation, which is the EU approach to stakeholders. And this was actually in the seminal paper on responsible innovation. So the British government basically is looking at that time to fund a bunch of balloons that'll float up into the air and reflect the sunlight away. So that was their bioengineered solution towards global warming, right? And because it was funded by the government, right, the government can insist that the research labs do certain things, right? Because it wasn't a corporate fund thing. So they insisted that you have public hearings about, what does the average person think about giant balloons floating in the air where you may not be able to see them, but that are reflecting the sun away? Because, from an engineering point of view, it's pretty damn cool. You got to admit it. That's kind of cool. However, these folks basically then, the average person points out that you're creating a moral hazard, right? That you're essentially encouraging people who might have started shifting to slightly more sustainable practices to abandon it and say, no problem, the giant balloons will take care of us, right? We don't really need to worry about CO2 emissions and so on. And so that's always given as an example of how including people who are not in the process produced an insight that the scientists themselves perhaps had forgotten about. Even with genetic engineering, the Isilomar conference, when Dolly the sheep, that happened in the 70s, that was the first conference where journalists were invited along with the scientists who had been funded by the National Institute of Health. And the journalists brought a totally different viewpoint. They are stakeholders because, they're speaking for all of us. And in fact, that is one example of an industry, a biotech industry, actually never doing a human clone. Maybe if it's been done, we don't know about it, right? But the fact is the industry held to self-regulation in that case with no government interference in terms of what they can or can't do. So external stakeholders bring wisdom to the process, right? I think that's the reason why it sort of fits into the wisdom part. But if you're a company, how do you go about doing it? And I'll give you an example of Mahindra & Mahindra. Mahindra & Mahindra is a wonderful automaker in India. Their vehicles, they do sell some farm equipment in the US. I don't think they have much of a presence here. But Mahindra & Mahindra is it's the number 2 automaker in the country. And they only make 4-wheel drives and off-road vehicles because for rural India, that's the kind of transportation that is appropriate on the roads over there. So the question is, who are all the stakeholders, right, for that particular thing? Is it just the drivers? Is it the drivers' families? Because, is it the farmer? Is it the leaser? I mean, you can think about folks. But they also included in the stakeholder group the people who just walk on the road with their goats and their cows on the same roads where these Jeeps are going by or where these 4x4 are going by. Because they wanted to figure out, what kind of splashing does this car do on those that are just walking by? Does it slip and potentially endanger somebody who's walking on the road? You don't see that here, but on dirt roads in India, you're basically going to see all kinds of traffic, all on the same 6 feet of not even asphalt, of mud, if you will. So there you have stakeholders that there was no reason for Mahindra & Mahindra to have involved them, but they believed it was part of their overall responsibility in order to build a product that worked not just for themselves, their drivers and those that were paying, but for those that might potentially get impacted in a uniquely Indian context. So those would be examples, I think, of folks stepping back and sort of saying, can I define stakeholders in as broad a manner as possible, and it'll still produce positive economic impact also.
Great. I have more questions, but now I think that I will move the floor over to you, and I don't know if you have questions.
Okay.
Wayne has a question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Wayne Visser. So, as you said, a lot of this is quite normative. And I'm wondering how you see it in practice where we agree on the principles, let's say. We all want to be wise. And if we look at 2 examples, climate change, and then what I'd like you to comment on, which is AI, we kind of know that these have consequences. We know that we should be behaving differently. We know that even the innovation we should be investing more in it. We've known that for years, and so on. So I guess the question is, how do you bridge the gap between knowing what is wise and persuading us individually and collectively and institutionally actually to act wise?
Okay. So I'll use the last tech disruption prior to AI, because sometimes when it's in the rearview mirror, it's easier to make sense. AI is still in the front of the windshield, if you will. So if you take a look at social networking, there's a wonderful Netflix film called The Social Dilemma, right? And it basically, amongst many things, looks at the rise of social networking. So one of them is the feature, I was in Silicon Valley at that time, the feature I hate the most is the like button, right? The like button, when it was introduced by a product manager who's featured in that film. in order to increase engagement. Because the whole idea of social networking was more time you spend on a site, the more quote-unquote addicted you are, the more they can sell you stuff, right? And they used good old psychology principles to sort of say, well, what will keep people coming back for more? Well, if it's about them in some manner, you know, they feel inclined to do so. Beautiful piece of psychological engineering, if you will, though the inventor may not have even studied psychology or whatever, right? He was a computer scientist. And so they build the like button. And soon the results begin to show, or at least hint at the fact, that this may have unintended consequences, right? It's causing teen depression, it's causing girls to slash their wrists, there's a whole notion of being unpopular, et cetera, right? I mean, teen culture is a strange thing, but that's what was going on there. Now, the point is, when did Facebook know? And when did Facebook do something about it, right? And honestly, they didn't do anything about it till they were hauled in front of Congress and Zuckerberg was, you know, sitting in front of a bunch of senators, which is a bit shameful because there were years leading up to that where it was obvious that this particular capability that Facebook had introduced was not a wise innovation by any means at all. Now, how could they have prevented it? That's why I said from a rear view mirror point of view. That team was basically a 6 to a 10-person team, right? Because all of this is agile teams. You know, you don't really need too many people to build features like this. It's a 6 to 10-person team of software developers and a product manager. They put something out because there is a larger vision the company wants. But in software, features are never completed, right? Everything, Google is still in beta, right? Everything is an ongoing iteration. Every week, there's a new capability. You never abandon what you've done. You just keep building on what it is. So every week, basically, or every 2 weeks, depending on the sprint cycle at Facebook, that team is getting together to decide what the next set of features are. Now, imagine if in that team, either the product manager or somebody had the wisdom to say, if again, looking at the wisdom principles, that we do care about the consequences, and therefore, in every stand-up that we have, or every time we do a release, every 2 weeks or 4 weeks, or even a quarterly business review release, we're basically going to take a look not just at the economic impact of this particular innovation, we're going to take a look at what else might be going on. Because, you know, you might find things that help you economically also. So forcing some of these processes into the development process of innovation companies, I believe can get you the kind of inclusivity and reflection and caring that you want. Then there are other things that are at a more personal level, right? If you're a manager, you know, one of my studies is basically showing is paradoxical priming can result in the same effect as somebody having a paradoxical mindset, right? And there's a strong association between a paradoxical mindset and the ability to be comfortable with these kinds of tricky situations where it looks like, oh my God, how am I going to, you know, satisfy everybody? Those with paradoxical mindsets, as you know, Merlin Spector has shown in her seminal research, are able to deal with it. Now, you can't hire people based on do you have a paradoxical mindset or not. But the research shows that paradoxical priming and leader behavior can oftentimes create a paradoxical mindset proxy in the innovators. So again, a responsible thing to do, a wise thing to do would be for a leader to sort of say, I need to model certain behaviors here. I should never present societal impact and economic impact as diametrically opposite things. I should always present them that we're going after, it's not an or, it's an and. So I think in terms of modeling leader behavior, in terms of process for development, you know, I was a management consultant for a while, so these were processes, and KPMG and Deloitte and all would be able to implement these. I think there are specific concrete things one could do around portfolio reviews, around incentive systems. You can hold back incentives for 2 years, for example, looking at a more balanced view of what the impact is. So I do think there are structural, incentive, process, and leadership kinds of things that are practical things a company could do. You know, but have they done it? No, not really, right? Hence it's normative and somewhat, you know, preachy, if you will. Yeah.
João Torres from KPMG. The whole proposed model is based on the being net positive. You referred, and we know, that measuring the net impact is a challenge. However, it should be crucial to select projects, I imagine, for the process, the implementation to be steered, the outcomes to be compared. Can you share a little bit of what are you using as a measurement technique or some kind of proposed model for that?
That is absolutely a weakness of this model, you know, that you've rightly identified. These things are hard to sort of compare against each other. and it eventually comes down to some sort of a subjective assessment, which is probably guided by the moral compass of the person who's making that assessment. And so two companies with two different leaders might look at the exact same data and conclude this is net positive or it's not net positive, or I don't care, or I do care. So you're absolutely right, which is the reason why I sort of said, I think a good research topic for us researchers would be, to the extent possible, to figure out if there are quantifiable ways of looking at this idea of net positive. You know, people have created the 3P index in some places, but they seem still a little immature, right? I mean, you know, you could take, for example, health outcomes and translate them into dollars, right? I mean, people do that all the time in the actuarial insurance business. But again, I think there are certain limitations, right? So I do think there's a lot of research to be done in how do you take three things that are fundamentally different from each other and are measured differently and put them together and say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And over time, again, you know, so there's a lot of subjectivity involved. There's a lot of gray spaces, ignorance involved, right? Which is why I'll be the first one to tell you it's normative and probably more passion and morals driven than it is necessarily scientifically driven. But if at KPMG you can drive that into some of your clients, that would be wonderful. You know.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's another question.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My question is, and following Professor Visser question, is about culture, because you spoke about Western culture, Eastern culture, and also the nowadays culture, a quick result culture. So, and this is a long-term solution. It's a long-term evaluation. Wisdom comes with time and experience. Do you think culture, or in which extent culture has to do with this approach, this model?
See, I think you're making a very interesting point because I struggle with this. You know, one would like to claim that, you know, there are certain cultures that are just sort of more thoughtful and wise and so forth. I'd like to say that and brag about it, but it's not true. The fact is, my Gen Zs, who are my students, are really no different than the Gen Zs that you have here, right? So all the cultural claims one could make, I'm not sure how much they hold. So I think you have youth that at one level is talking a good game about sustainability, but it'd be interesting to sort of say, okay, how much convenience would you really be willing to give up to live a sustainable life? And I'll tell you that my young people are not willing to give up a whole lot of convenience, though they are wonderful and articulate while talking about how important it is to be like Greta, right? But on the other hand, they want their pizza in 8 minutes, right? So I don't know how to reconcile the culture versus youth or culture versus pop culture, I guess, right? Old culture versus pop culture, I think, is kind of the XY we're looking at. So not sure what to do that. And also, I don't think the Western and Eastern cultures are actually that fundamentally different. And that was the point I was trying to make, right? I think philosophically and spiritually, if you look at the East and the West, I see more similarities than I see differences. And so if we agree that, you know, a long-term view, and this, by the way, goes not just to the East or the West, Native American culture, with their emphasis on living in harmony and so forth, right? So I think the world over, we know what wisdom is. I don't think any one culture has to claim superiority. The problem is the pressures of modern life and short-sightedness, which many people have, right? It's a different matter. I mean, you and I are old. You know, we can go back and look at 40, 50 years of our lives and 30 years looking forward. A 25-year-old may not necessarily have that level of wisdom. So as educators, we try to do what we can. You know, we send our students for 5 weeks into the rural villages. You know, we do that before their corporate internships. You know, they go and spend, you know, out somewhere, right, doing things for NGOs. We send them a whole year into the urban slums to basically one-on-one work with a kid, and then they hand it over to the next MBA student the following year. So these urban slum kids who are very poor spend 6 years with our MBA students from the 6th grade to the 12th grade. So we do all these things in order to try and, you know, maybe accelerate the wisdom curve for our students. It works for some people, it doesn't work for some people, you know, so, yeah.
There's a book I love, it's called Nature and Power. from Joachim Radko. He says that no such thing of adaptation or ecological synergies between the human being and nature. He went to the data, historical data, and from the beginning of human race, I think everything starts to fall. So there's no such thing of adaptation. Adaptation, yes, but no such thing of symbiosis or something like that between human race and the environment. So we must start from ground zero. And for example, AI being the solution to organizing and to low the entropy, I think in a way the human brain consumes about 20% of the energy of our energy, and the neurological network 10-15% more. So in a way, if we are starting to create a network in the society to organize the information and the systemic organization, the data centers already consume, I think, 12 or 15% of the energy worldwide. So what's the solution? Thinking that culture is important and research and development also, but this link between human and the so-called nature, is it a possibility? Is it a myth? What's in your opinion that approach? Is it possible for us to
So you have two questions, right? The first one is sort of science trying to claim control over nature, right? Which is, are they symbiotic or not, is your first question. And the second question is around energy usage, especially with AI. So I'll take the first question about symbiosis between science and harmony, if you will. Now again, anything I say, please don't take it the wrong way about Western culture or whatever. It's not what I mean. But I'll just make one point of difference. Science universally has been viewed as a way of understanding nature, right? Whether it is Eastern science or Western science. I mean, that was the whole idea. Why does the sun rise in the east? Why do storms happen, right? So it's about understanding nature. The desire to control nature, right, which is really where science and engineering sort of comes into play, is a little bit more of a Western tradition, which the rest of the world has followed. So, for example, the Native Americans absolutely had no concept of science or anything trying to control nature, right? Native American culture is almost entirely, so American Indian culture, if you will, or Native American culture, is almost entirely about harmony. If you go back into the ancient scriptures of the Indian texts as well, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedantas, and so forth, again, while there is a lot of curiosity about why things are, so the scientific tradition exists, but the notion that you use science to control the environment around you doesn't quite exist in that culture, right? So I do think there have been instances. The dominant paradigm is the Western paradigm now, I understand that. But there have been instances in human history where I think mankind, womankind, humankind has had the wisdom to think about coexistence, right? So I'm not going to entirely give up on humanity. I think it's a tall order, long fight. But I do think it's possible to be scientific and creative and innovative without necessarily the desire to quote-unquote control, right? So that would be one part. But on control and AI, to your question, there's if you take a look at, I'm working on a paper called Wise Artificial Intelligence. Actually, I'm calling it Artificial Wisdom, right? So let's basically take a look at how systems are built. If you look at systems, AI systems, imagine agentic AI. So let's say you have AI bots for customer support, for marketing, and so on, right? And that's happening today. And what you're looking at, let's say, is to build an entirely AI network, which is wise, that will make good decisions. How might you do so, right? And again, if you draw from human network, and Professor Richard Boland of Case Western did this thing called perspective making and perspective taking. So we're trying to model that in AI. And what we're basically looking at is if you have multiple agents, but just like you have GANs or adversarial networks, generative adversarial networks where one AI challenges the other or challenges the other's output, our idea is that a network of AI bots, even without human intervention, if they are forced to explain their reasoning to the next AI, collectively will basically emulate and show some of the, the normative behaviors here that we're talking about, that you take multiple perspectives, you challenge, you reason, and you collectively figure out what everybody can sort of agree on. But this requires transparency that AI doesn't have today, right? Explainable AI is a problem today. And so bringing explainability in, having methods by which AI agents can communicate with each other, I think can use technology to take the best of human wisdom, I think, and implement it. Will it take a lot of energy? I think you're right. I mean, right now the consumption of electricity is way too high, but there are techniques.
And the thing in a way is that our gains of efficiency must compensate the AI introduction. So because we don't have space to add more energy to the system, you know.
Yeah.
So to balance this kind of approach, I think it's almost impossible. For example, you were talking about the American
Native Americans.
Native Americans. Yeah. You know, they use fire to hunt fires that lasted for years. For example, there's a footprint in the Arctic of the fires from the savannas in the United States when the human beings came to that ecosystems. So in a way, we don't have this kind of benevolence approach to nature. We are you talked about Matrix, and it's the amazing. But in a way, I think that we must to introduce AI. We must really start to be a lot of introducing a lot of efficiency in the other parts to balance the footprint of AI, because it will be huge.
Yeah. So I'd like to hope for the best but prepare for the worst, as they say, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's end now. Thank you, Varun, very much for coming.
Thanks so much.
It's an amazing session.
Thanks.
Good.
Thank you all for being here today in our first conference day. Hope to see you all tomorrow. For those who want to follow the online oral presentation session, you may find the link at your QR code. And tomorrow, the industry branch will start at 2:30. So see you tomorrow then.